Hey everyone, how's it going? And welcome back to InfoGamer. Also welcome back to this Unity tutorial series on how to recreate a Super Mario Run clone. Now in our last video we showed you how to add more animations to our main character as well as how to control those animations using the animator component of Unity. This was a lot of fun to do because we are now finally able to start seeing our game come to life with our main character able to move and animate at the same time. Now, if this is the first video in this tutorial playlist that you're checking out, I highly recommend that you start at the beginning of our playlist so that you can work through it with us and that you can create your own version of Super Mario Run. You can find the beginning of our playlist in the card on the top right corner of our screen. Now for this video, what we want to show you is how to start constructing your own levels for your Mario Run game. And we're going to be doing this in the most simple way possible by using basic cubes in Unity. Now the nice thing about Super Mario Run, and for that matter pretty much all the Mario games out there, is that the levels that you'll find in a Mario game are static. And what I mean by that is that they don't really change. Each level is designed beforehand by a level designer or a person that's put in charge of designing the levels, and he determines what the level is going to be. And then every time you play that level, it's going to be the exact same pretty much every single time. There might be slight variations like what monsters appear and stuff like that, but for the most part, the levels are always going to be the same. And so what we want to do in this video is show you the process of designing a level, and then you can use this same process to design your own levels for your very own Super Mario Run clone. And so let's get started. So here we have our project open in Unity, and I'm going to go ahead and hit play so that we can run through this game and you can see how far it's come. So here we have our character and he's walking along, and when I click the screen we can see that he does his wall jump and his wall grab and he just keeps going. But here is the end of the basic placeholder level or environment that we've created for our character. And so it's not very interesting right now. We do have some walls for our character to jump between, but we really need to make our game more interesting. And so in this video, we're going to change that. So the first thing that we want to do is create a new folder. So I'm going to right click on our assets folder, go create folder, and this is going to be a texture folder. This is what we're going to save all the textures in for our environment. And then I'm going to right click on our textures folder and create a new folder, and this is going to be materials. So when we add new textures to our asset folder or our texture folder, we're then going to create materials out of that texture, and we're going to save them in our materials folder. So the first texture that we're going to go get is just the basic brick texture that you find in pretty much all the Mario games. So here I have Google Images open and I've searched Mario brick texture, and I'm just gonna pick this one because it's really simple and basic and it's pretty good quality. So I'm gonna right click on that, go save image as, and then I'm going to find the actual location that I want to save it in, which is under games right there, and assets, textures, and I'm gonna save it here in the textures, but I'm going to give it a new name. I'm going to call it brick, and I'm going to save it as a PNG. That works. So let's go ahead and hit save and then go back to Unity. So here you can see now that we have our brick texture in Unity. And so when I select that, you can see that it's set to a default texture type, which is what we want. Now what we need to do is create a material out of this texture. So I'm going to select our materials folder, right click, go create, and then find material, and let's name this as brick. We could name it brick matte. And then what we want to do is go back to our textures folder while we keep our material selected, and then we're going to select our brick texture and drag it into the albedo box to the left right here. And here you can see now that our texture has been applied to this material, but it's kind of shiny and I don't really want it to be shiny, so I'm going to bring the smoothness down to 0. We could also make it a little darker if we wanted to, or a little redder. So I'm going to tone that down just a tad bit, maybe bring that up and a little bit of color. Maybe right about there. All right, so now that we have this material created, let's go ahead and create the basic block that we're going to be using. So I'm going to, in our hierarchy, select create, and then 3D object and cube. And here you can see that we have a new cube created. The next thing that I'm going to do is select our material and drag it onto that cube in our scene view. Let's go ahead and rename this cube to basic block. Now there's a number of ways that we could go about constructing the levels for our Mario Run game. I've actually seen plugins out there for 2D platform builders where you essentially click and drag the corner points of a mesh around to the shape that you want your platforms to be in, and then it kind of fills in the mesh with the various textures that you want to have be the floor and the walls and such. And those are really cool, and if you find a really good one out there in the asset store, you can go ahead and use those to construct the levels in your game. Now there's a number of ways that we could go about constructing the levels for our Mario Run game. I've actually seen plugins out there that are essentially 2D platform builders where you'd click and drag the corner points of a mesh around to be the shape that you want it to be, and then it fills in the mesh with the various textures for the floor and the walls and such. It's really cool. And if you find one of those 2D platform builder plugins out there or while looking through the asset store, you're welcome to use one of those to build the levels of your Mario Run game. What we're going to be doing is we're just going to be using basic shapes like this cube with the brick texture to develop more prefabs or sections of our levels, and then we can quickly build levels out of those prefabs. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to right click on our prefabs folder. Let's create a new folder, and this is going to be level prefabs. So I'm going to call the folder level. And then I'm inside this folder, I'm going to click and drag our basic block prefab into this folder to create a new prefab. So now that our basic block is highlighted in blue in the hierarchy, we now know that it is a prefab. And so now we can just click and drag as many of these blocks into our hierarchy as we want, and then we can kind of move them around in our scene view. Another way that we could do this is just by selecting our block object, and by hitting Control D we can duplicate our block object, and then we can move it around in our scene the way we see fit. So now I'm going to show you how to start creating basic prefabs of sections of the levels that we want. And so I'm going to start by creating an empty game object, and this is going to be the parent of our entire level section. So let's rename this to be something like floor, and we could say 10 long. 10 long. Let's go ahead and zero out this transform to 0, 0, 0. And then what we want to do is click and drag our basic block object onto this new empty game object that we created. So here it's now a child of that object. I'm going to go ahead and zero out the transform. And then what we can do is duplicate this object 9 times. And then we can select each object and increment its X position by 1 each time. So 1, 2. All right, so there we have a floor section of our level, and it is 10 cubes long. And we can now save this floor 10 long as a prefab in our game. So now that we have this floor prefab in our game, let's go ahead and position the floor where we want the floor to be at the beginning of our level. But to start with, I'm going to go ahead and delete this ground object that we had created in a previous video, because that was just a placeholder for testing purposes. Now let's go ahead and grab our floor 10 long object, and I collapsed it so that we can just grab the top parent object and drag it around. And then we want to make sure that we have pivot selected, not center, because pivot's going to be at the beginning of our object, and we know that it is on the center of the start cube. And so to move this object to the position that we want it to be, we can grab the arrows in the scene view of the transform and drag it around. But this isn't going to be very accurate because we're just dragging it around, and then the position of this object becomes a float value. And so to get this to be a solid number, what we can do is we can select the arrow in the direction that we want to move it and then hold Control as we're dragging it, and that will snap it to the positions. But before you do that, you need to make sure that you start at a solid numbers position. So I'm going to say 0, and then I'm going to select the X arrow and hold Control, and now it's snapping to that solid number. And then I'm going to drag it to underneath our character and a little bit off the left side of the screen, and then I'm going to drag it down to the bottom of our scene. So right about there. Now what I can do is I can just go ahead and duplicate this game object, and then I can click on the X directions transform arrow and hold Control and drag it over until it's flush with the right side of the previous floor section. So there we go, we have a new floor section and it's looking pretty good. So if I go ahead and hit play, our character can now run on a brick textured ground. It's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and delete these wall sections. And while we're at it, we can also delete these coins because these coins are a prefab and we can just drag them into the scene when we want them. And so let's create a few more sections of our level by doing the same process of creating an empty game object and then adding this basic block object to that game object and positioning them how we want them to be. And then let's create a level out of those sections. So first off, I'm going to create a new empty game object, and let's name this to be wall, and then we could say 5 high. And we want to make sure that we zero out the transform of this parent, and then let's drag on a basic block prefab to that object. So here we have that object, but this basic block object is now not centered on our parent. So let's go ahead and center it by hitting 0, 0 in the X and the Y. And now what we need to do is we need to duplicate this object, so Control D, and then I'm going to actually do that 4 times. So there we go, and then with each one of these I'm going to increment the Y to be a +1, and then +2, +3, and +4. So now we have a wall that is 5 blocks high, and we can then click on the wall 5 high and drag it into our level prefab folder to create a new prefab. And now we can select this wall and we can hold the X transform arrow and then hold Control and then drag it to where we want this wall to be. So there we go. And if we wanted to, we could just go ahead and delete the wall 5 high object from our hierarchy if we don't want to use it at this point. So we can just have our floor, and then once we create the rest of our prefabs, we can add those in later. And so I'm going to delete it from our hierarchy, even though I just positioned it there. And if I wanted to bring it back into the scene, I could just click on the wall 5 high from the prefabs folder and drag it into the hierarchy. And then I would zero out the transform and position it where I want it to be. And so let's go ahead and create a few more prefabs. So this one is going to be a stair object. So I'm going to type stairs, and let's say 5 high. And then we want to make sure that we zero out the transform, and then let's drag on a basic block object, and then let's select the basic block object and duplicate it, and then we can increment the X1 and then duplicate that, and we can increment the Y1, and then we can duplicate that and increment the X to 2 and duplicate that, Y to 2, duplicate that, X to 3 and duplicate that, Y to 3. How many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll do a few more. Duplicate 4, duplicate 4. So there we have a stair object, and you can see that there's a bunch of empty space underneath the stair. And so if you wanted to, you could just go in and fill in that stairs, or if you don't really care, you can just have it go in a zigzag pattern like that. But let's go ahead and fill it in if we want. So I'm going to select this one, and I'm going to duplicate that, and then we'll do 3, nope, 2, and then we'll duplicate it again. We'll go 3, and then we'll duplicate that and go up 1 in the Y, duplicate, and we could actually duplicate both of these, and then we could move it over to 4, and then we could duplicate 1 and move it up to 2. So there we go, we have it all filled in. And now what we can do is we can drag our stair high object into our prefabs folder. Now the cool thing with prefabs like these stairs is if we wanted the stairs to be facing the opposite direction, there's a few things that we could do. We could either make the scale of the object in the x direction -1, or we could make the rotation in the y direction, whoops, I need to change that back to 180, and that would flip it around to be the opposite direction. And then what we could do is if we wanted to, we could save this as another prefab. We could say stairs 5 high 180, and then we could drag it into the prefabs folder. And then anytime we drag it into the scene, it's going to be facing the other way. But the problem with this is if we're going to then be instantiating this object into the scene, we need to make sure that we're instantiating it with this rotation. But with Mario Run, as we told you earlier, most of the Mario games, all the levels are static, and so there shouldn't be any instantiating of the objects or the scene. All you really need to do is build the scenes and then save them as scene world 1, level 1, and then call that scene or load that scene in your game. Alright, so I'm going to be using the next little while to build a scene, and I'm going to fast forward through this part, but really all I'm going to be doing is dragging in various prefabs that I've already created. I might create a few more if I feel like it, but then I'm going to be using just the click and drag transform with holding control to position these objects where I want them to be. So let's get started. Okay, so here's a little level that I whipped together real quick, and I didn't even really have a plan for it. I just kind of put the prefabs where I felt like they should go. And one thing that we're going to do before we test it out is that we're going to create a new empty game object, and we're going to name this level. And then what we can do is select all the prefabs that we use to create our level, and we can click and drag them onto the level object. And that just consolidates everything, puts it into a nice little package, and we can close it and then not really worry about the environment and what it takes to make it, and we can just have it done. And so let's go ahead and hit play, and we can run through this level. So here we have our character, he's running along, and as I click and jump, I can jump over that brick, and then I can jump and whoops, oh no, I missed the jump. And it looks like some of the animations are a bit glitchy, and that's probably due to just our code not being very refined. Now, if we spent much more time developing the code and working with the animator and making sure all the transitions were working properly, then our our character wouldn't really have any problem animating. So there we have it. That's basically how to create the basic structure of your levels, and at least the floors and the walls. Now Mario has a bunch of other cool objects that you can add in, such as the tubes, that sometimes monsters pop out of the tubes, or sometimes it's a secret passageway. Now we can show you how to create, model, and add those in a later video. This was really just to get a feel of how to build the walls and the floors for a Mario Run game. Now there's a few things that we could do to improve our game or to optimize our game, and that is to reduce the amount of colliders that we find in our game. Right now you can see that each one of these cubes has its very own box collider, and if we have individual boxes or individual blocks, that's fine. That block can have its own collider. But if we are building a 10 long floor piece like we've done, and we've created it into a prefab, there's ways that we can reduce the amount of colliders on that object. And the best way to do this would be to select all the basic blocks on that prefab and then remove the box collider on that object. And then rather than having the box collider on the individual blocks, we would select the parent object and add a box collider. And then what we would need to do is, right now the box collider is only on this first cube, and so we can click this edit collider, and then we can click on this square right here on the right side of our block, that little tiny square, and then we can hold control and we can drag it out till it reaches the end of the 10 cubes. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So right there. And if I, whoops, somehow this end got dragged out. So I'm going to drag that down to there. A little short. Right about there. Okay, so now we have a box collider that spans all 10 blocks, and it's part of the parent object. And I can double check that by selecting this parent object, dragging it out. And yeah, it looks like that green line goes just to the end of the 10th block. And so what we can now do is, with that object selected, we can then hit apply up here, and we can then select the other objects, and you can see that we have a box collider on the other prefabs that are the same prefab. And so that's one real quick way to better optimize your game. And we can do that same thing with the vertical wall. So rather than having an individual box collider per cube on our wall, we can select all of those, remove the box collider from each individual one, so remove component, and then with the parent object selected, we can select box collider, and then we can select edit collider, grab that little vertice, hold control, and drag it up 5 cubes. So right there, down one, right there. And then we can go ahead with the parent selected, hit apply, and then we can look at the other wall objects, and we can see that there's a collider on the parent object, but not the basic blocks that make it up. So one last point that I want to mention is, right now our game consists of 3D objects. We have our 3D chef and our 3D blocks and floors and walls, and that's really cool, and it gives what's called a 2.5D perspective. And so right now what that means is that even though we have 3D objects and our camera is shooting a perspective view, we are playing the game as if it was a 2D game, because our camera is only ever shooting from one angle. So we're always following our character from left to right, and we're never like rotating the camera around our character. And so that's what's called a 2.5D perspective. But when you look closely to Super Mario Run, the game is actually all orthographic and 2D. And so if we wanted to make our game more like Super Mario Run, what we can do is we can go to our main camera, and then we can just change our projection from perspective to orthographic. And then that gives it the Super Mario Run 2D perspective. And so when I play it this way, you can see that we have our character and he's running, and then we can jump, and you can see that the blocks definitely look 2D. But then you might say, hey, well, that's kind of weird because like the blocks look 2D even though they're 3D, and our character looks 2D even though he's 3D, and Mario in Super Mario Run looks 3D. Like he looks like a model. He doesn't look like a sprite or something that someone drew. He looks like someone modeled him. And so you might say, is Mario a model or is he drawn or something like that? And what's most likely happening, for the purpose of a phone being not a console or anything super powerful, and they need to optimize the game as much as possible, what they're probably doing is they initially created Mario as a 3D object as we have here. And then they gave him his rig and his animations, his running, jumping, and whatnot. And then what they did is they took still frames, still PNG frames of each of those animations. They just took each frame of the animation as a PNG. And then they put it onto a sprite sheet and slice that sprite sheet up and then do a sprite sheet render animation. And so that's why you might say Mario kind of looks 3D, but he's probably most likely 2D. But for this purpose, we are just going to stick with 3D because we're probably not going to put this out as a direct copy of Mario Run. We're going to keep our game in a 2D, 2.5D perspective. But if you wanted to, you could make your game in orthographic view like Super Mario Run. So I'm going to go ahead and just change this back to perspective view. So there you go. We've now shown you how to create the basic structure of your levels with walls and floors. Right now, we just have a simple block brick texture put on a cube, and then we're duplicating that cube and creating prefab sections of our level, and then we create levels out of those sections. And so we hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure that you like and subscribe and share with your friends, because it's always better to be coding with friends. So we'll talk to you later. See you next time.